Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and moral corruption. We have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Let's do a quick list of some of our favorite things. Coffee, tea, beer, wine, booze, cigars, green olives, Vegemite. What do these things all have in common? Well, people love these things. But I think most of us can agree that they all fall under the umbrella of acquired tastes. Meaning however much you like them all now, and I do, the first time you tried any of these, chances are you thought they tasted terrible. But once you've gone back to the well a few times, suddenly the switch flips, and each of these items undergoes an extreme recalibration. In other words, they go from being nasty to utterly delicious. They are acquired tastes. I should mention that an article written by Kieran Conliffe for headstuff.org was instrumental in putting together today's episode, and that, as per usual, all my sources can be found in the show notes. Alright, back to our list of delicious acquired tastes. Coffee, tea, beer, wine, booze, cigars, green olives, Vegemite. I doubt it escaped your notice that everything on this list of acquired tastes, with the exception of green olives and Vegemite, has an intoxicating effect. Even Vegemite, with its naturally occurring MSG and high levels of B vitamins, which tend to have an energizing effect, even Vegemite, it could be argued, is intoxicating. Now, the thing about acquired tastes is, generally speaking, they aren't acquired immediately. It's unlikely that the very first time you ever took a sip of your dad's beer, you said to yourself, "Oh my god, that's delicious. It tastes just like a cold glass of Sunny D after soccer practice." No, I don't think that's what you thought. If you're like the rest of us, you had to subject yourself to the nastiness repeatedly and with purpose before that magical moment when the gross suddenly became permanently delicious. And of course, it's hardly coincidental that nearly all of these acquired tastes are also intoxicants. As our brains come to desire or even rely upon the desired effect, it's all that much easier to convince our taste buds that they're encountering something delicious. Mind over matter and all that, you know. Meanwhile, our bodies still attempt to warn us that we're ingesting poison. That's why they all taste bad for a while. Even with the added carrot of a buzz, we must still be beaten with the stick of yuckiness over and over before our taste buds do the eventual 180 flip and we become a craver of that particular flavor. Well, today, I'm here to talk to you about an acquired taste that may not be acquired at all. In other words, at least some evidence suggests that this forbidden food is scrumptious from the first bite and forever after. And the evidence? Well, that would be the stories I'm telling today. The stories of Native American guide Swift Runner and of Irish-born Australian convict Alexander Pearce. And the scrumptious food I'm referring to? Why, human flesh, of course. In fact, ask Swift Runner and Alexander Pearce what they think of human flesh, and they may sound a lot like Will Ferrell in the seminal early 2000s comedy, Old School.
Once it hits your lips, it's so good!
Once it hits your lips, it's so good, indeed. So now, if you're ready, please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies. It tastes far better than fish or pork. Swift Runner, Alexander Pearce, and the horror of Wendigo worldwide starts now. You may be familiar with the legend of the Wendigo. The Wendigo is a cryptid belonging to the Algonquin-speaking tribes of North America. They are described as impossibly gaunt, almost skeletal creatures, extremely tall, 7 feet or more, with the antlers of a buck or reindeer rising above their heads, making them impossibly even taller. They have long arms, long claws, and eyes that glow red. It is said that a Wendigo is created when a person, driven to the brink of madness by starvation, consumes human flesh. Upon consumption of human flesh, they will be transformed into a Wendigo, forever ravenous, never sated, and always and only hungry for human flesh. Their ever-present cannibalistic urges drive them to kill again and again. And from the legend of the Wendigo was born a psychological disorder known as Wendigo Syndrome. Wendigo disorder describes a person who believes they are a Wendigo, or more to the point, a person who behaves in all ways like a Wendigo and lacks only the physical appearance of a Wendigo. In other words, once this person has sated their hunger on human flesh, they find that they are starving, always and forevermore, consumed by a hunger that can never be sated, and that they desire to eat only human flesh and nothing else. They find the lure of consuming the flesh of their fellow humans to be irresistible, the flavor of that flesh to be delicious, and yet, even when they have crammed their bellies to bursting, they find that their hunger can never be put to rest. One such true story of Wendigo Derangement Syndrome, the story of Swift Runner, is where we begin today. And once we've finished with Swift Runner, we'll travel from the frozen tundras of Canada to the much warmer temperatures of the Australian penal colony, where one convict, Alexander Pearce, discovers that his cannibalistic urges, the desire to eat people, cannot be repressed. Welcome to Wendigo Worldwide. The first legal hanging in Alberta, Canada took place on December 20th, 1879. Almost 150 years later, it is still remembered as one of the province's worst and strangest crimes. The hanged man was a native Cree known as Swift Runner, who was on good terms with frontier authorities. They trusted him as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. That is, until Swift Runner's violent whiskey benders unbalanced him so much that the police sent him back to his tribe. And then, his tribe kicked him out too. When Swift Runner was expelled, he took to the wilderness for the winter of 1878 and 79, and he brought his family with him, a wife, a mother, a brother, and 6 children. But only Swift Runner would return from the winter camp. When police were alerted to the suspicious absence of Swift Runner's family, the former guide himself escorted investigators to the scene. One of Swift Runner's 6 children had died of natural causes and was buried at the camp. The other 8 humans had been reduced to bones, strewn about the camp like the set of a slasher film. They had all been gobbled up by a Wendigo. As mentioned at the top, a Wendigo is a frightful supernatural beast of Algonquin mythology so ravenous it is said to devour its own lips. If you'd like to give yourself a fright, go ahead and Google it. According to Swift Runner, the Wendigo spirit had entered him and compelled him to slaughter and eat all of his relations. Swift Runner became the poster child for Wendigo psychosis, a mental disorder thought to be particular to the northern Algonquin peoples. In the psychosis, which was diagnosed in the early 1900s but hotly disputed in psychological literature, people are said to have experienced themselves possessed by the Wendigo and racked by violent dreams and compulsions to commit cannibalism. Wendigo psychosis is importantly distinguished from famine cannibalism, for although it was the wilderness during winter, Swift Runner had access to other food when he turned Wendigo. The author of a 1916 report on the phenomenon said he had known of a few instances of this deplorable turn of mind, and not one could plead true hunger, let alone famine, as an excuse for it. The disorder, whatever it was nevertheless surely connected to the precariousness of life in the wilderness. Wendigo cases vanished in the 20th century as afflicted populations came in closer and closer contact with encroaching sedentary civilization. In other words, as soon as there were reliably villages, towns, and cities nearby, cases of Wendigo psychosis dried up. For Canadian authorities in 1879, however, there was no X-Files case or philosophical puzzle here. There was simply a man, Swiftrunner, who had shot, bludgeoned, and or strangled his whole family, and this is gnarly, guys. He also snapped open all of their bones and sucked them clean of marrow, which indicates someone who was not eating just for sustenance necessarily, but who was truly enjoying his repast. But if the verdict and sentence were clear, the logistics were less so. Hangings were virgin territory for Fort Saskatchewan. Swiftrunner, repentant by the time his day of execution rolled around, had to wait in the cold on the frigid morning of his hanging while the old pensioner hired to hang him retrieved the straps he'd forgotten to pinion his man, and fixed the gallows trap. With a bit of gallows humor all his own, Swiftrunner was reported to have said, "I could just kill myself with a tomahawk and save the hangman further trouble." Yikes, that's dark. But hanged he was. Now, the story of Swiftrunner is a swift, if you will, snapshot of a man gone mad in the winter woods who devoured his family. It is the literal textbook example of Wendigo psychosis. Now we'll move on to another story, one we'll spend a little bit more time with. The story of a different man from a different culture on the other side of the world who nevertheless, like Swiftrunner, found that he had developed a taste for human flesh that he simply could not or did not want to shake. We now travel from Alberta, Canada, to the island of Tasmania off the coast of Australia for the story of the Tasmanian cannibal, Alexander Pearce. Although it's true that the European settlers of Australia were largely convicts, it was far from a lawless place in the early 19th century during the heyday of transportation. The sentence of transportation was a compromise by a British government moving away from the old, quote, bloody code, unquote, that saw people hanged for stealing anything worth more than a shilling. They didn't want to go to the expense of building prisons, so instead they settled on sending people to the fringes of the empire. Wild, unsettled lands where they might be able to, quote, civilize, unquote, things through forced labor. So, throughout the 18th and 19th century, men, women, and children were transported for crimes like stealing cheese, carrying a burglar's tools, bigamy, and pretending to sell somebody wine. Petty crimes, in other words. Some convicts made their sentence into an opportunity and built a new, better life on the other side of the world. Most served their time in colonies quietly, and then returned home when their sentence was served. And then there were those who refused to abide, and found themselves sentenced to a prison within the prison. Alexander Pearce, the Tasmanian cannibal, was one of these. Alexander Pearce was born in County Monaghan, Ireland, sometime in 1790. Very little is known of his early life except that he was poor. He mostly found work as a farm laborer and probably supplemented his income with petty criminal activities. In 1819, those activities caught up with him, and he was convicted by a court in Ireland for stealing 6 pairs of shoes. He was a shoe thief, ladies and gentlemen. 29-year-old Pearce was sentenced to 7 years of transportation, loaded onto a ship, and then taken halfway around the world to the island of Tasmania. At the time, Tasmania was called Van Diemen's Land after the Dutch governor who'd sent the expedition that founded it. Up until 1800, convicts had been sent to New South Wales on the Australian mainland. But as New South Wales transitioned into a more standard colony, the residents objected to the constant influx of convicted criminals. And so, the criminals were diverted to Tasmania. Given the nonviolent nature of Pearce's crime, stealing 6 pairs of shoes, he was probably assigned to work as a farm laborer, not that different from what he'd been doing back in Ireland. Also not that different was Pearce's tendency towards, shall we say, side hustles. He committed various offenses, starting with stealing ducks and turkeys, and then working his way up to forging a work order. Hold on a second, so this horror of a guy that I'm in the process of telling you about, the cannibal of Tasmania, the New South Wales Wendigo, his initial criminal offenses were stealing 6 pairs of shoes and stealing ducks and turkeys. He was a shoe, duck, and turkey thief, and he somehow wound up being a cannibal. Boy, talk about a prison system having a rehabilitation problem, huh? Woo! Alright, back to it. After stealing ducks and turkeys and shoes, he worked his way up to forging a work order, and this was a serious enough offense that when it was discovered in May of 1822, he absconded. Absconded was the official term for when a convict abandoned their sentence. A $10 reward was offered for his arrest, and the Hobart Town Gazette gave the following description of him. Alexander Pearce, a convict, number 102, charged with various misdemeanors, is 5 foot 3 1/4 inches tall, brown hair, hazel eyes, age 30, a laborer tried at Armagh, Ireland in 1819, sentenced to 7 years, arrived in the colony at Castle Forbes in 1820, born in County Moynihan, and he's covered in pockmarks. So he's a pockmarked duck, turkey, and shoe thief who got 7 years, a little more than 1 year per each of the 6 pairs of shoes that he stole. And it's also of note that he's a much smaller than average man at 5 foot 3 1/4 inches. Okay, so when he first absconds, leaves the colony, escapes from his sentence, although since most prisoners in Australia weren't actually locked up, I think that's why they called it absconding as opposed to breaking out, if you will. Pearce is recaptured, but since he had violated the trust placed in him as a prison colony laborer, he was not sent back to work as a laborer, but instead he was sent to Macquarie Harbour on the west coast of the island of Tasmania. This was considered the ideal place to hold incorrigible convicts, as it was surrounded by waters so treacherous that even ships approached with great care. In fact, more than a few convicts never made it to the prison on Macquarie Island because their ships strayed from the narrow sea passage and were wrecked. So what we're talking about here, guys, is the Australian Alcatraz. 5 foot 3 1/4 inch Alexander Pearce stole 6 pair of shoes, some ducks, some turkeys, and then he forged a work order. Oh boy. And he winds up at Macquarie Harbour, Tasmania, the Australian Alcatraz, with a 7-year bid. I mean, if that kind of sentencing overkill isn't enough to drive you to eat people, I don't know what is. I kid. So here we are at Macquarie Harbour. The harbor on the land side was surrounded by mountainous wilderness with hundreds of miles of travel to the main settlements on the other side of the island. So it's not exactly Alcatraz, but functionally it is. On one side you have nearly impassable ocean waters, on the other side you have hundreds of miles of Tasmanian bush. There's nowhere to go if you get out. Macquarie Harbour was considered entirely escape-proof. So naturally, less than 2 months after he arrived on the island, Alexander Pearce tried to escape. Pearce was part of a work gang with 7 other men cutting down trees on the edge of the settlement on the 20th of September, 1822, when they made their escape attempt. The ringleader was Robert Greenhill, a former sailor who came up with a plan to steal a whaleboat and head out to try to reach either mainland China or one of the Pacific Islands. Their exact destination never became an issue because the boat was too heavily defended for them to steal it. Before scouting the boat for a potential hijacking, however, they had overpowered their overseer. Even though they couldn't steal the boat, they were already committed to some form of escape. So Pearce, Greenhill, and the 6 other men headed off into the impassable wilderness with the idea that anything was better than Macquarie Harbour. Although Greenhill, who as a sailor was used to navigating, took the lead, none of the escapees were used to living outdoors. Greenhill's leadership may also have come from him commandeering the overseer's axe when they fled. That sounds about right. Frankly, even if Pearce and the 7 others had all been practiced survival experts, the Tasmanian wilderness was so bleak that there was almost no life to be found. After 8 days, the men were starving and desperate, and that was when the cannibalism began. Pearce later claimed that the reason they chose to kill Alexander Dalton was because in prison he had been one of the volunteers who issued floggings to those who broke the rules. Boy, takes balls of steel to be the guy who volunteers to whip other prisoners when you're a prisoner yourself. Jiminy Christmas, balls of steel or brains of none, I guess. Floggings were a regular occurrence in Macquarie Harbor. In the year following Pearce's escape, 1823, it's estimated that 9,100 lashes were given to the total prisoner population. Men who volunteered for that type of duty were generally despised. Duh. So the only question would be if they decided on the cannibalism before or after one of them murdered Dalton. Either way, the deed was done, and the 7 starving survivors feasted. The next morning, there were only 5 of them. Edward Brown and William Kennerly had decided that some things were worse than Macquarie Harbor, so they fled under the cover of darkness. They did manage to find their way back, but they both died within a few days of returning. Officially, both men died of exhaustion. Unofficially, their deaths might have been helped along by the rough discipline meted out to escapees like them. But if it was the latter, it wasn't recorded, obviously. There are some inconsistencies in Pearce's account of the escape. In some accounts, he says that it was actually Thomas Bodenham who they killed and ate after he lost in a drawing of lots, and that Dalton fled the camp along with Kennerly and Brown. If that's true, then Dalton didn't make it back to Macquarie Harbor with them. But if he was the first victim, then Bodenham was the second. That left Pearce, Greenhill, Matthew Travers, and John Mather trudging through the wilderness. Mather was the next to go, 5 weeks into their journey. Now there were 3 men left, and things were looking bleak for Alexander Pearce because Travers was close friends with Robert Greenhill, and Greenhill was the one with the axe. But things weren't as bad as they could have been because by now they'd made it through the mountains and were in an area where they could scavenge some food. But the new terrain brought new dangers that the 3 men were ill-equipped to deal with. Now remember, there are 3 men left. 8 escaped originally. 2 got freaked out by the initial case of cannibalism and ran back to the prison. So 3 men have been eaten thus far. But while drinking water from a creek, Travers was bitten on the foot by a tiger snake, one of the deadliest snakes in Australia. The bite of a tiger snake invariably causes death unless treated with antivenom. This is where another inconsistency in Pearce's story comes up. He claimed that he and Greenhill brought Travers along with them for 5 days before mercy killing him in his sleep. But if it was a tiger snake that bit him, he wouldn't have survived that long. But however it happened, Travers died and the 2 survivors fed. After Travers' death, things got somewhat tense. I bet. Neither Greenhill nor Pearce trusted each other, and they did their best to avoid sleeping. After 8 days, Greenhill finally was too exhausted, and Pearce took advantage. He managed to get the axe without waking Greenhill and then killed him with a single blow to the head. That left Alexander Pearce as the sole survivor of the 8 men who had escaped Macquarie Harbor less than 2 months earlier. Somehow, Pearce managed to make it the rest of the way to the edges of the Tasmanian colonies on the east coast. He knew he'd made it when he found sheep grazing in a field. And, in an unlikely coincidence, the first person he met in those colonies was an old friend who was working as a shepherd for those sheep and who found him eating one of them that he'd killed. The friend pointed him towards a local gang of bushrangers, escaped convicts like him who survived by rustling sheep. Pearce joined the gang. But unfortunately for him, a month and a half later, they were all captured by the Tasmanian authorities. The examining magistrate in Pearce's case was the Reverend Robert Knopwood. Knopwood had been born in England as the 3rd son of a wealthy family who became an Anglican priest at the age of 26. He inherited a fortune when his elder siblings died before his parents, and then lost it all gambling beyond his means when he fell in with the Prince Regent's crown. Forced to find employment, he took a post as a Navy chaplain, and then became the official chaplain and later magistrate for the town of Hobart. He served in that post for 20 years, and his diaries are now one of the best primary sources for early conditions in Tasmania. Pearce's case must have been one of the last ones he ever heard before his retirement. The sudden appearance of a convict who should have been in Macquarie Harbor, the unescapable Australian Alcatraz, caused some consternation, and Pearce was pressed to give an account of how he made it across the island. Perhaps out of guilt, he made a full confession, the details of their escape, how they'd turned on each other, and the multiple instances of cannibalism he had committed. In fact, his confession was so frank and shocking, even by rough frontier standards, that Knopwood didn't believe him. I would imagine that the fact that Pearce was 5'3" and apparently had managed to overpower 7 other convicts and eat them, or 5 other convicts, the 2 ran back to the prison. Still, I imagine that also contributed to the fact that Knopwood didn't believe him. Magistrate Knopwood came to the conclusion that Pearce had invented his story in order to cover for the others who had escaped with him, and that some of them must still be out there as bushrangers. So instead of the death sentence he expected, Pearce was sent right back to Macquarie Harbor. This is not the end, folks. Because he had escaped once, Pearce was ironed, made to wear restrictive iron shackles on his legs so that he could not escape again. This did more than restrain him, though. It also marked him out as a symbol to his fellow inmates that escape was possible. One man who was entranced by that promise was Thomas Cox. Cox was an Englishman who'd only been 17 years old when he was sent to Tasmania. His crime must have been a severe one, since, while most were only transported for 7 years, Cox was sent for, quote, the term of his natural life, unquote. This was reflected in his conduct in Tasmania, as he quickly became an absconder. When caught, he managed to break out of prison, but he was caught again and sent to Macquarie Harbor. Despite his confession, it's likely that Pearce hadn't mentioned his cannibalism to the other prisoners. Even if there were rumors, Cox would have been desperate enough to ignore them. He was facing the rest of his life in Macquarie Harbor, a place as close to hell on earth as could be imagined. He had a plan, and he had equipment: stolen fish hooks, a piece of flint to start a fire, and scorched rags to use for tinder. Cox spent months trying to persuade Pearce to escape with him. Eventually, after he'd been flogged for stealing a shirt, Pearce cracked. While they were north up the coast from the harbor on a foraging expedition, they bolted into the wilderness. 11 days later, Pearce was recaptured at the mouth of the King River after he lit a signal fire and surrendered to a passing boat. He told the pilot, who recognized him, that Cox had drowned in the river. When they searched him, they found a piece of flesh in Pearce's pocket. Pearce admitted that he'd cut it from Cox's corpse to prove that Cox was dead. Then, he changed his story and admitted that he had killed Cox. The next day, Pearce was taken out to retrieve Cox's body. What they found was horror. Cox's head and hands had been removed from his body. He had been disemboweled, which any butcher will tell you is the first step in turning a body, hopefully an animal body, into meat. The flesh had been carved from his flanks, legs, and arms. There was a bloody axe nearby, which Pearce admitted was the murder weapon. Back at the prison, Pearce made a confession. He told them that he and Cox had planned to go round the coast to the north to reach the settlement of Port Dalrymple, since Pearce knew how barren the mountains were. When they reached the King River, though, they'd hit a problem. One thing Cox hadn't told Pearce was that he didn't know how to swim. When Pearce found this out, he lost his temper and killed Cox with an axe. They'd stolen the axe in order to break off Pearce's irons. Then, Pearce had butchered the corpse, but he'd been overcome with self-loathing and thrown the meat into the river before eating it. He'd kept a piece in his pocket to prove his crime and signaled the boat. Pearce said at that time that he was ready to die for his crime, but when the case went to trial, he'd changed his mind. Charged with murder, he pleaded not guilty. The grounds for his defense was that he had killed Cox during an argument and was only guilty of manslaughter. By now, his confession to Knopwood was well enough known that the jury had to be told by the judge to disregard it, but it made no difference to their verdict. They found Pearce guilty of murder, and he was executed a month later. Before he died, he made one final confession, which differed in details but was largely identical in content to his previous ones. His last words were recorded as being, and I quote, "Man's flesh is delicious. It tastes far better than fish or pork." Yeesh. Holy moly. Before I let you go, please let me remind you of the free 3-digit lifeline number 988 that you can call anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to receive immediate assistance for mental health, substance use, or suicidal thoughts. So God forbid, but if you find yourself in acute crisis, please do call 988. Program it into your phone now. And please do always remember that the world is a better place with you in it, and you are loved. Now, if you're in acute crisis, I'm not the right person to reach out to because I'm not qualified to help you with that. But if you'd like to reach out to someone just to make a connection, to tell your story, to share your thoughts, to let me know what's going on with your life, please do feel free to reach out to me at Kinda Murdery on all social media, kindamurdery@gmail.com, or you can call the Kinda Murdery hotline 888-MURDERY, that's 888-687-3379, where you can leave a message and tell me what's going on with you, or you can tell me your kind of murdery story and inspire an episode of the show. But what I want you to know is that I'm here, I care, and I would love to connect with you. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.